The silence was the first thing he had given her in a century. Not a tense, waiting silence, filled with the anticipation of his next command, but a vast, hollow quiet that belonged entirely to her. Vivian had cultivated it like a rare and delicate garden. For 6 months, she had lived within its walls, here in the disused solarium at the northernmost point of the palace, a place of cold stone and forgotten constellations painted on the ceiling. The dust motes that danced in the slivers of moonlight were her only courtiers now, and they asked nothing of her. She had not left. Leaving would have been a statement, a declaration of war or wounded pride. It would have been an act, and she was done with acting. She had simply stopped. One evening, after he had dismissed her counsel before the entire war council, calling her meticulous planning the work of a frightened mouse, she had returned to her chambers, taken off the fine silks of her station, and never put them back on. She had ceased her endless rounds of the palace, her quiet negotiations in shadowy alcoves, her inspections of the kitchens for poison, her monitoring of the guards' loyalties. She had ceased to be the invisible scaffolding that held his glittering, precarious kingdom upright. She had stepped back, and in the space she vacated, a vacuum had formed. Nature, and politics, abhorred it. The first assassination attempt was crude. A poisoned blade in a crowded hall. She'd heard the screams from her solarium, a faint, frantic sound like gulls fighting over a scrap. She had felt the tremor of panic that shuddered through the castle's ancient stones. For a moment, a flicker of the old instinct flared in her chest, the urge to run, to secure the perimeter, to find him, to ensure the fool was still breathing. It was a physical ache, a phantom limb of responsibility. But she held herself still, her fingers gripping the cold stone of the window ledge, and watched the moon climb higher, impassive and white. She learned later that he had survived, but the garter snake sigil of the assassins had been left behind a minor house he had personally insulted and disenfranchised 3 years prior. A house she had warned him to placate. The second blow was quieter, but deeper. The emissaries from the Sunken Isles arrived to finalize a trade treaty that had taken her a decade of careful diplomacy to build. Lucian, brimming with the arrogant confidence of a man who had just survived a blade in the ribs, decided to handle the final negotiations himself. He was a creature of grand pronouncements and charming threats, not the painstaking nuance required. He saw inflexibility where there was sacred tradition, he saw weakness where there was deep-rooted pride. Vivian had not needed to be there to know how it had unfolded. She could picture it, his easy, dismissive smile, the way he would have leaned back in his throne, all casual power, while the Isle's matriarch, a woman whose lineage was carved into the very coral of her throne, would have sat rigid, her dignity flaking away with every careless word he uttered. The treaty was not just broken, it was shattered. The Isles recalled their ships and their grain, and the first whispers of famine began to haunt the port districts. By the third incident, it was no longer about him. It was about the kingdom itself. A cabal of his own lords, men whose families had served his for generations, attempted to invoke an ancient and forgotten charter to have him declared unfit to rule. The coup was clumsy, born of desperation rather than cunning, and it failed. But it laid bare the rot that had taken root in his court. Loyalty had curdled into fear, and respect into resentment. His reign, once a thing of glittering spectacle, was now a crumbling facade. Through it all, Vivian remained in her solarium. She read books bound in cracked leather, traced the faded star charts on the ceiling, and listened to the slow, steady rhythm of her own stilled heart. She was not waiting for him. She was not plotting. She was simply being. For the first time since he had remade her in his own eternal image, she was existing for herself alone. The silence was hers. The stillness was hers. And in that quiet, she was discovering the person she had been before she had become his shadow. She was remembering the woman who had advised his father, a king with half of Lucian's charisma but twice his wisdom. The woman who had believed in the promise of his lineage, a promise Lucian was now systematically dismantling. It took him 6 months to the day. 6 months of chaos, of bleeding alliances and whispered treacheries. 6 months for the echo of his own arrogance to grow loud enough for even him to hear. The knock on her door was hesitant. Not the imperious rap of a king, but the uncertain tap of a stranger in a foreign land. She did not answer. The sound of her name, when he spoke it through the heavy oak, was raw. Stripped of its usual command, it was just a word, a collection of sounds holding the weight of a century of shared history. Vivian. She remained seated by the window, watching the first pale fingers of dawn stretch across the sky. The light did not touch her skin. She had long since learned to live in the hours others wasted in sleep. Vivian, please. The please was the most surprising thing she had heard in 50 years. It was a word he reserved for foreign monarchs and deities he didn't believe in. He had never once used it with her. She rose, her movements fluid and silent, and unlatched the door. He stood on the threshold, and the sight of him was a shock. The king she knew was an immaculate creature, all tailored velvet, polished leather, and effortless authority. The man standing before her was diminished. His hair, usually a perfect cascade of silver gilt, was disheveled. There were dark, bruised-looking circles under his eyes, the kind even their immortal nature could not entirely erase after prolonged stress. His fine doublet was rumpled, and he held himself not with the posture of a king, but with the weary slump of a defeated soldier. He stared at her, and his gaze was not one of anger or command. It was a look of raw, desperate discovery, as if he were seeing her for the first time. He took in the simple, unadorned grey dress she wore, the bareness of her chambers, the quiet solitude that clung to her like a shroud. "I didn't understand," he said, and his voice was a rasp. It was the sound of a man who had been shouting for months, only to realize he was in an empty room. I thought you were my shadow." Vivian said nothing. She simply watched him, her expression as placid as the surface of a deep, cold lake. He took a half step into the room, his eyes scanning the space, the stacks of books, the single chair, the window open to the cold night air. A shadow follows. It mimics. It has no will of its own. It is nothing without the light that casts it. He looked back at her, and a tremor went through his powerful frame. "But you weren't my shadow, were you? You were my shield. And I was standing in front of you, basking in the light, thinking I was invincible. All while you were taking the arrows." It was a staggering admission. More than she had ever expected. The metaphor was apt, painfully so. She had deflected so many blows meant for him that she had forgotten what it felt like not to be braced for impact. He looked down at his hands, then back up at her. "The assassination attempt, the snake sigil. You warned me about the House of Seraph. You told me to give them the southern pasture rights." She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "The sunken isles," he continued, his voice cracking. "Their matriarch values humility above all else. You told me to greet her on the docks, not to summon her to the throne room. You told me to offer her milk and honey before we ever spoke of coin." Another quiet nod. "The lords, the charter, you knew they were meeting. You knew their grievances were legitimate. You had a list of concessions prepared. Small things. Tax levies on wool, appointments to the judiciary. Things that would have cost me nothing and bought me their loyalty for another generation." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of pure anguish. "I threw the list in the fire. I called it cowardice." He finally met her eyes again, and she saw the full scope of his ruin there. It was not just the crumbling kingdom. It was the shattering of his own self-perception. He had built his identity on a foundation of effortless superiority, and he had just discovered the foundation was not his own. It was her. "I have failed," he whispered. The words seemed to tear something from him as they came out. "In every way a king can fail. In every way a man can fail. I dismissed you. I mocked you. I used your loyalty as a whetstone for my own vanity." He fell silent, the confession hanging in the cold air between them. He did not ask her to come back. He did not command her to fix what he had broken. He simply stood there, a king without a kingdom, a man laid bare. "I am not asking you to be my shield again," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "I am asking for the chance to earn what I squandered. I am asking you to teach me how to see the arrows myself." Vivian looked at him for a long, silent moment. She saw the desperation, the exhaustion, the genuine, soul-deep crack in his pride. But she also saw the man who had turned her, not out of affection, but to ensure her counsel would never be lost to old age. The man who had taken her loyalty for granted for so long that he had forgotten it was a gift. Hope was a dangerous, fragile thing. She had buried hers long ago. She stepped back from the door, leaving it open. It was not an invitation, not yet. It was an allowance. The grain shipments from the Isles are gone, she said, her voice even and calm, betraying none of the turmoil inside her. The northern harvests were poor. The port districts will be starving in a month. What is your solution? He blinked, thrown by the sudden, practical question. He had come for absolution, for a grand emotional scene. She had given him a logistics problem. I had thought to levy a grain tax on the inland territories, he began, the old, familiar cadence of authority returning for a moment. The inland lords are the ones who just tried to depose you, Vivian stated, her voice flat. Taxing them now will be seen as punitive. It will push them from quiet resentment to open rebellion. You will have a civil war on your hands before the first snows fall. The flicker of confidence in his eyes died. He looked lost again. Then, what? That is for you to determine, she said, turning away from him and walking back to her window. Bring me your proposals. All of them. And I will show you where they will fail. The work is yours, Lucien. Not mine. He stood in the doorway for a long time, caught between the ruins of his world and this cold, quiet room where the possibility of rebuilding it resided. Finally, he gave a stiff, formal bow, a gesture of respect he hadn't offered her in decades. I will, he said, and then he was gone, leaving the door ajar. Vivian listened to his footsteps retreat down the long, empty corridor. The silence he left behind was different from the one she had cultivated. It was no longer empty. It was filled with a question, a fragile and terrifying possibility. The work had begun. The first few weeks were an exercise in excruciating patience. Lucien would appear at her door each evening, his arms laden with scrolls and maps, his face etched with a frustration so deep it seemed to have carved new lines into his immortal features. He was a man accustomed to immediate solutions, to bending the world to his will through sheer force of personality. He was learning, now, the slow, grinding work of actual governance. He would unroll a map of the grain distribution networks, his finger tracing a route with aggressive certainty. We will reroute the grain from the western duchies. They had a surplus. Vivian, from her chair by the window, would not even look at the map. Duke Alaric's eldest daughter is to be married to the son of the lord you just dispossessed for treason. He blames you for the dishonor to his family. His surplus will rot in its silos before he sends a single bushel to feed your city. Lucien's jaw would tighten. He would roll up the scroll with a snap, his movements sharp with anger. In the beginning, he would argue. He would pace the length of the solarium, his voice rising, falling back on the old patterns of command and indignation. He would rail against the pettiness of his vassals, the injustice of their disloyalty, the sheer inefficiency of it all. Vivian would simply wait, her silence a mirror reflecting his own impotent fury. She would not soothe him. She would not offer a solution. She would let him exhaust himself against the wall of reality. After his anger had spent itself, a heavy, defeated quiet would settle over the room. He would sink into the chair opposite hers, the fire gone out of him, and ask, his voice low, why? And she would tell him. She would calmly recount the history of Duke Alaric's family, the intricate web of debts and honors and slights that bound the nobility together. She would explain the nuances of their culture, a thing he had always considered beneath his notice. He had ruled them for over a century, yet he was only now beginning to learn their language. He was a poor student at first. His pride was a constant impediment. More than once, he stormed from her chambers, declaring her counsel impossible, her standards unattainable. But he always came back. The next evening, or the one after, he would be at her door again, the same scrolls in his hands, his eyes holding a grudging respect. The crumbling of his kingdom was a more persuasive teacher than she could ever be. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, a shift began. He stopped presenting grand, flawed pronouncements and started asking tentative questions. He would arrive not with a solution, but with a problem, laying it out before her like a complex puzzle. The river clans are demanding tribute. They say their fishing grounds are barren. My portmaster says they are lying, that their nets are full, and they mean to extort us. What does the river look like? Vivian would ask. What? The color of the water. The height of the tides. The health of the reeds along the bank. Have you looked? He hadn't, of course. He had never been to the murky, salt-stained docks where the river clans made their homes. The next day, he went. He returned near dawn, his fine boots caked in mud, the smell of the river clinging to him. It's brown, he said, his voice flat with a dawning horror. Thick with silt. The runoff from the new quarries upstream is choking the spawning beds. They aren't lying. They're starving. He had spent the entire day speaking with the clan elders, not as a king demanding answers, but as a man listening to grievances. He had seen the empty drying racks, the mended nets, the gaunt faces of their children. For the first time, a report from a portmaster had become a human reality. He proposed a solution, halting the quarry work, commissioning a dredging of the riverbed, and providing the clans with short-term aid from the royal stores. It was costly. It was complicated. It was the right thing to do. It was the first decision he made that felt like his own, yet was forged from her methods. When he explained it to her, she gave him a single, brief nod. For Lucien, who had once commanded armies with a flick of his wrist, that small gesture of approval felt like a greater victory than any battle he had ever won. Their sessions in the solarium developed a rhythm, a ritual. He would bring maps and ledgers, she would provide context and memory. He learned to see the kingdom not as a map of territories to be controlled, but as a living tapestry of families, histories, and obligations. He learned the names of the merchants' guilds, the grievances of the miners, the feast days of the harvest gods in the southern farmlands. He was learning to see the intricate, fragile ecosystem he had nearly destroyed. One evening, he arrived without scrolls. In his hands, he carried a small, wooden box. He set it on the table between them. It was not a gift of jewels or finery, the sort of thing he used to bestow upon courtiers to purchase their loyalty. I was in the royal library, he said, his gaze fixed on the box. I remembered you speaking of the cartographers of the unseen. You said their work was lost in the burning of the great archive. Vivian looked at him, her composure faltering for the first time in months. The cartographers of the unseen were a mythical order of scholars who had attempted to map not the physical world, but the flows of magic, emotion, and memory. She had mentioned them to him in passing, decades ago. She had never imagined he'd been listening. He slid the box toward her. It is not the original, of course. But my father's grandfather commissioned a copy of one of their atlases. It has been sitting in the lowest vault, miscatalogued. I thought it might please you. She opened the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a book bound in star-dusted leather. She lifted it, the weight of it familiar and strange. She opened it to a random page. It was a map, but not of any land she knew. It showed a coastline of sorrow, a forest of doubt, a river of memory. It was breathtakingly beautiful, a piece of impossible art. She looked up at him, and her carefully constructed neutrality was gone. In her eyes, he saw a flicker of the woman she had been, the scholar, the dreamer. He had not brought her a tool for governance. He had brought her a piece of her own forgotten soul. It was a gesture not of appeasement, but of recognition. He was finally seeing her. Thank you, Lucien, she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion she could not name. He simply nodded, a strange mixture of relief and trepidation on his face. He had offered a piece of himself, not his power, but his attention, his memory, and it had been accepted. It was a fragile bridge, built across a chasm of his own making. For the first time, he felt the terrifying, exhilarating possibility that they might one day be able to cross it. The silence in the room was no longer a weapon or a shield. It was a shared space, filled with the unspoken weight of what was being rebuilt between them. The day of the Grand Council was cold, the sky a sheet of hammered pewter. The great hall was filled to capacity, a tense and murmuring sea of velvets and furs. Every major lord, guild master, and envoy was present, drawn by the scent of the king's weakness. They had come to watch him fail. For months, Lucien's authority had been a ghost haunting the throne, his commands ignored, his pronouncements met with sullen silence. Now, he had summoned them to address the crisis of the coming winter, and the assembly crackled with a predatory anticipation. They expected blustering threats or desperate pleas. They were hungry for a final, definitive collapse. Vivian stood near the back of the hall, half hidden by the shadows of a great stone pillar. It was the first time she had attended a formal court function since she had withdrawn. Her presence had not gone unnoticed. Whispers followed her like the rustle of dry leaves, eyes glancing from her to the king, trying to decipher the new calculus of power. She wore her simple grey dress, an island of austerity in the ocean of courtly finery. She was not there as an advisor, not officially. She was there as a witness. Lucien entered not with his customary fanfare of trumpets, but in silence. He walked the long aisle to the throne alone, his stride measured and deliberate. He looked neither arrogant nor defeated. He looked sober. He took his seat on the high-backed throne, the weight of the crown on his head seeming less a symbol of power and more a burden he had finally chosen to bear. He let the silence stretch, his gaze sweeping over the hostile, expectant faces. The Lucien of 6 months ago would have started with a declaration, a show of force. This Lucien began with a confession. "I have failed you," he said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the hall, amplified by the stunned silence. "As your king, I have been arrogant. I have been blind. I have mistaken the strength of my kingdom for my own, and in my pride, I have nearly broken it." A wave of shock rippled through the assembly. Lords exchanged uneasy glances. This was not the speech they had been expecting. "The famine that looms is a crisis of my own making," he continued, his eyes finding Duke Alaric in the crowd. "I have alienated allies, ignored sound counsel, and placed my own vanity before the needs of my people." He laid out the situation with brutal, unsparing honesty. He spoke of the failed treaty with the Sunken Isles, the alienation of the inland duchies, the suffering of the river clans. He spared himself nothing. He was not making excuses, he was building a case against himself. As he spoke, the mood in the hall began to shift from predatory glee to a confused, wary attention. This was not the behavior of a tyrant clinging to power. It was something else entirely. Then, he began to outline his plan. It was the culmination of weeks of their work in the solarium. It was a complex, multifaceted strategy that addressed not just the immediate crisis, but the deeper wounds he had inflicted. He spoke of reopening diplomatic channels with the Isles, offering not just trade, but a formal apology and reparations for the quarry damage. He spoke of a new council, with seats for the guild masters and even the clan elders, to ensure the grievances of the commons were heard. He proposed a series of targeted investments and tax reliefs for the inland lords, designed to rebuild their trust and prosperity. It was a masterful plan, intricate, fair, and wise. It bore all the hallmarks of Vivian's careful, long-sighted strategy. As he spoke, a lord known for his bluntness called out, "These are wise words, your majesty. But they are not your words. For a century, you have been a storm. This is the counsel of a calm sea. Who has been advising you?" The question hung in the air, a direct challenge to his authority. The old Lucien would have had the man arrested for his impertinence. The hall held its breath, waiting for the explosion. Lucien's gaze swept the hall until it found her, standing in the shadows. He held her eyes for a long moment, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. The entire court turned as one, following his gaze, and a collective gasp went through the room as they saw Vivian. He turned back to the assembly. "For too long," he said, his voice resonating with a new, unfamiliar timbre of humility, "I have relied upon a counsel I did not value. I have been fortunate to have at my side one whose wisdom far exceeds my own. I claimed her victories as mine, and blamed her caution for my failures." He rose from the throne, a startling breach of protocol. He walked to the edge of the dais, his eyes still on Vivian. "The plan I have laid before you," he said, his voice growing thick with an emotion he did not fight to conceal, "is not mine alone. It was forged from the wisdom of the person I most wronged. It is the work of Lady Vivian." His voice broke on her name. It was not a crack of weakness, but of profound, shattering sincerity. The sound of it, so raw and vulnerable, echoed in the cavernous hall. In that moment, he was not a king. He was a man, publicly confessing his greatest error and giving credit where it had been so long denied. He was offering her up to the court, not as his shadow, but as his peer. More than his peer, as the architect of their salvation. It was an incredible political risk. He was admitting his own inadequacy, making himself vulnerable before his enemies. Vivian felt the weight of 1,000 pairs of eyes. She did not flinch. She simply met his gaze from across the room. She saw the terror in his eyes, but also a fierce, unwavering resolve. He had done it. He had taken the hardest step. Slowly, deliberately, Duke Alaric, the man who had the most reason to hate him, began to clap. It was a slow, measured sound in the stunned silence. Then another lord joined him, and another. Soon, the entire hall was filled with a thunderous, rolling applause. It was not for him, not entirely. It was for the act itself. For the shocking, profound humility of a king admitting his fault. It was for the hope of a different kind of rule. Lucian stood on the dais, not basking in the sound, but looking only at her. In his eyes, she saw a question. Was this enough? She gave him the smallest of nods, a gesture invisible to all but him. But for him, it was everything. It was the first stone laid in the foundation of a new kingdom. And a new understanding between them. The work was far from over, but in the echoing hall, amidst the applause of his astonished court, he felt the first, fragile warmth of a dawn he had thought would never come. In the weeks that followed the Grand Council, the atmosphere in the palace transformed. The cloying fog of fear and resentment began to dissipate, replaced by a brisk, purposeful energy. Lucian's public confession had not shattered his authority as he had feared, it had remade it. His lords, who had despised his arrogance, found themselves willing to follow a king who had the strength to admit his weakness. He worked tirelessly, implementing the plans they had forged together, but he was no longer alone. He had the grudging, and then genuine, support of his council. The sessions in the solarium continued, but their nature changed. They were no longer lessons, but collaborations. They would sit for hours, maps and missives spread between them, the candlelight glinting off the faded constellations on the ceiling. The dynamic was one of equals. He would listen to her insights with a focused intensity, and she, in turn, would listen to his, recognizing the shrewd political instincts that lay beneath the layers of pride she had helped him peel away. He was still Lucian. He could be impatient, demanding, and possessed of a temper that could flare like summer lightning. But now, he was capable of catching himself. He learned to pause, to breathe, to reconsider. More than once, in the heat of a debate, he would fall back into his old habits, his voice rising with imperious command. He would see the shuttered look come over her face, the subtle withdrawal, and he would stop himself mid-sentence. "I apologize, Vivian," he would say, the words still tasting strange on his tongue. "That was the old way. Explain your reasoning again. I will listen." And she would. Slowly, the walls she had built around herself began to lower, brick by painstaking brick. She found herself offering opinions before he asked for them, anticipating problems not just for the kingdom, but for him. The old instincts of protection were returning, but they were different now. They were not born of duty or habit, but of a burgeoning, fragile affection. She was not shielding a king, she was supporting a partner. One night, as a cold rain lashed against the glass of the solarium, he looked up from a trade manifest and simply watched her. She was reading a letter from the Sunken Isles matriarch, a small, thoughtful frown on her face. The candlelight softened the severe lines of her expression, catching the silver threads in her dark hair. He was struck, not for the first time, by her quiet beauty, a quality he had never allowed himself to see before. "What did you do?" he asked, his voice soft. She looked up, startled from her thoughts. "What do you mean?" "In those 6 months," he clarified. "When you were here, alone. What did you do?" It was the first truly personal question he had asked her in a century. Their conversations had been confined to matters of state, to the mechanics of their new working relationship. This question was about her internal world. Vivian set the letter down, her long fingers resting on the parchment. "I read," she said. "I watched the stars. I remembered what it was to have a thought that was not immediately followed by a calculation of how it would affect you. The statement was not an accusation. It was a simple fact, but it landed with the weight of one. He had not just occupied her time, he had colonized her mind. Was it peaceful? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. At first, it was terrifying, she admitted, her gaze distant. The silence was so loud. I had defined myself by my utility to you for so long, I wasn't sure who I was without it. I had to reacquaint myself with the person I was before. She looked at him then, her eyes clear and direct. She is quieter than I remembered. And far more stubborn. A faint smile touched Lucien's lips. I am becoming acquainted with her myself. He paused, the rain drumming a gentle rhythm against the glass. Do you miss it? The peace? It was a vulnerable question. He was asking if his return to her life had been an unwelcome intrusion, if the fragile partnership they were building was a cage she would rather escape. Vivian considered the question for a long moment. She looked around the solarium, at the books, the maps, the comfortable quiet of the room that had been her sanctuary. Then she looked at him, at the genuine concern in his eyes, the hard-won humility that now sat so much more naturally on his features than his old arrogance ever had. I have come to believe, she said slowly, choosing her words with care, that true peace is not found in the absence of struggle. It is found in the presence of a trusted ally. The admission hung in the air between them, as profound and binding as any oath. He had never been her ally. He had been her master, her king, her charge. An ally was something new. Something equal. He reached across the table, his hand open, palm up. It was an offering, not a demand. A simple gesture that contained a universe of meaning. It was an invitation to close the final distance between them. For a moment, she hesitated. To take his hand was to accept everything, the painful past, the uncertain future, the terrifying possibility of trusting him again, completely. But as she looked at his face, she saw that he was just as terrified as she was. His carefully rebuilt composure was gone, replaced by a raw, pleading vulnerability. He was not a king demanding fealty. He was a man asking for connection. Slowly, she lifted her own hand and placed it in his. His fingers closed around hers, his touch gentle but firm. His skin was cool, like marble, but there was a warmth that seemed to radiate from the core of him, a heat she had not felt in a very long time. It was not the fire of his temper or his passion, but the steady, quiet warmth of a hearth. They sat like that for a long time, the rain outside and the silence within, their hands clasped over a map of a kingdom they were rebuilding together. It was not an ending. It was not even a beginning. It was a turning point, a quiet moment of arrival after a long and arduous journey. The shield and the king were gone. In their place sat two rulers, two partners, two souls who had found their way back from the brink, not to what they had been, but to something new. Something stronger. Something forged not in power, but in the devastating, redemptive grace of being truly seen. The first true test of their new alliance came with the spring thaw. Word arrived from the northern borderlands, carried by a half-frozen scout, a horde of the Unchained, wild clans of vampires driven mad by hunger and exile, were moving south, devouring entire villages in their path. They were a plague, a force of nature Lucien had previously dealt with by sending legions of soldiers to die, a blunt instrument against a scattered, desperate foe. His generals were already clamoring for the same old strategy, for a massive mobilization of troops to form a wall of steel against the tide. In the war room, surrounded by the grim, eager faces of his commanders, Lucien was a different man. He listened patiently to their plans, to their talk of glorious charges and acceptable losses. He studied the map, his brow furrowed in concentration. The old Lucien would have been swept up in their martial fervor, eager to prove his strength on the battlefield. Instead, he turned to Vivian, who stood beside him, her presence in the war room now an accepted, essential fact. "Your thoughts?" he asked, his voice calm, cutting through the din of military bravado. The generals fell silent, their expressions ranging from resentment to grudging respect. They had learned over the past months that her quiet voice often carried more weight than a royal decree. "A wall of steel will break," Vivian said, her finger tracing a path on the map not of armies, but of rivers and mountain passes. They are not an army, they are a flood. They will flow around any obstacle. We cannot fight their strength. We must use their weakness. Their weakness? One of the generals scoffed. They are a tide of starving, immortal killers. They have no weakness. They are starving, Vivian corrected him gently. That is their weakness. They are moving along the path of least resistance, from one village to the next, because they are desperate. They are not conquerors, they are foragers. Lucien looked at the map, seeing it now through her eyes. Not as a battlefield, but as a landscape. So we don't stop them, he murmured, the pieces of a new strategy clicking into place in his mind. We guide them. The plan they devised together was audacious and utterly unconventional. Instead of a massive army, they would deploy small, elite units. Their purpose was not to engage the Unchained, but to evacuate the villages in their path, creating a cordon of empty, barren land. They would leave nothing behind for the horde to feed on. Simultaneously, they would use other units to herd vast quantities of wild game, deer, elk, boar, into a single, remote valley deep in the uninhabited western mountains. We are setting a table for them, Lucien explained to his stunned council. We will make the path to that valley the easiest one for them to take. We will lead them away from our people not with swords, but with the promise of a full belly. It was a strategy of immense risk. It required precise timing, discipline, and a faith in the enemy's predictability. It also meant ceding territory, however temporarily, a concept that was anathema to his military leaders. But Lucien held firm. We are not losing land, he insisted. We are saving lives. A king's strength is not measured in the leagues he controls, but in the people he protects. The words felt true on his tongue. They were a creed he was only just beginning to understand, a lesson learned in the cold silence of Vivian's solarium. He decided to lead the Central Evacuation Command himself, while Vivian, to the shock of the entire court, would coordinate the complex logistics of the animal herding from a forward command post near the Western Valley. It was a separation, a test of their ability to function as two parts of a single mind. The night before he was to depart, he found her in the armory, overseeing the final preparations for her own contingent. She was speaking quietly with a scout, her expression focused and intense. She moved with an understated authority that was more compelling than any command. When she was finished, he approached her. The armory was loud with the sounds of sharpening steel and oiled leather, but a small bubble of quiet seemed to form around them. It is a risk, you going to the field, he said, his voice low. It is a calculated one, she replied, her eyes meeting his. The logistics are too complex to be managed from the capital. I must be there to adapt to the horde's movements. That is not the risk I meant, he said. He was afraid for her. The emotion was so sharp and clear it startled him. For a century, he had valued her for her utility. Now, the thought of her in danger was a physical pain, a cold knot in his gut. She saw it in his face. A flicker of something soft and warm moved in her own expression. You will lead your command, she said. I will lead mine. We will trust each other to do the work. That is the alliance, is it not? He nodded, the word alliance feeling both too small and exactly right for what existed between them. He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before he gently touched her arm, his fingers closing over the worn leather of her bracer. Be safe, Vivian, he whispered. You as well, Lucien, she replied, her voice just as quiet. The campaign was a grueling, nerve-wracking affair. For 3 weeks, they were connected only by a frantic series of messengers on sweat-lathered horses. Lucien oversaw the evacuations, a heart-wrenching process of uprooting families from their ancestral homes, convincing them to abandon everything on the promise of safety. He was no longer a distant king on a throne, but a leader on the ground, sharing in their fear and their hardship. He ate their coarse bread, slept on the cold ground, and listened to their stories. He was earning their trust not with proclamations, but with his presence. Meanwhile, Vivian performed a miracle of logistics and strategy. Her units moved like ghosts through the forests, using scent, sound, and fire to drive the scattered herds of game into a single, inexorable migration toward the appointed valley. It was a delicate, dangerous dance, conducted on the very edge of the Unchained's advance. Twice, her outriders had to engage small bands of the horde that broke from the main path, and her dispatches, though coolly professional, could not hide the peril she was in. The final phase was the most dangerous. As the horde, weakened by hunger and confusion, was finally lured into the narrow pass leading to the Valley of Game, Lucien's forces, who had been shadowing them, had to close the trap. They were to create a diversion, a massive, noisy display of fire and arms on the far side of the valley, ensuring the Unchained would be too preoccupied with their hunt to notice the pass was being sealed behind them with a rockslide triggered by his engineers. But something went wrong. A sudden blizzard swept down from the peaks, obscuring sight lines and muffling sound. The diversion was not enough. A significant portion of the horde, perhaps a quarter of its full strength, turned back, their preternatural senses detecting the trap. They charged back toward the pass, where Vivien's command post was located, a small, lightly defended encampment. The message reached Lucien in a panic. Vivien was about to be overrun. His generals urged him to pull back, to save the main body of his army. The losses were acceptable, they argued. The strategy had largely worked. Lucien looked at the swirling snow on the map, at the marker indicating her position. He thought of her face in the armory, the quiet strength in her eyes. He thought of her hand in his. An alliance. A trusted ally. He gave an order that froze the blood of his commanders. He was not pulling back. He was charging. Taking the Royal Guard, his best and most loyal cavalry, he would ride directly into the blizzard, into the teeth of the retreating horde, to relieve her position. It was a suicidal, reckless plan. It was the charge of a madman, or a lover. The ride was a frozen hell, a blind plunge through a world of white fury. But Lucien pushed them on, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He was not thinking of his kingdom, or his crown. He was thinking only of her. He found her encampment just as the first wave of the Unchained crashed against its hastily erected barricades. Vivien was not cowering in a tent. She was on the line, a sword in her hand, her face grim and pale in the flickering torchlight. She moved with a deadly, economical grace, a warrior he had never known existed. Lucien's charge hit the horde's flank like a thunderbolt. They were a force of pure desperation and fury, and for a moment, chaos reigned. In the heart of the swirling melee, Lucien saw her. He saw a massive Unchained break through the line, its eyes fixed on her, its claws extended. He spurred his horse, a wordless roar tearing from his throat. He reached her side just as the creature lunged. He threw himself from the saddle, his body crashing into hers, sending them both tumbling into the bloody snow as his horse trampled the attacker. He landed atop her, his body shielding hers. For a moment, the battle raged around them, a surreal vortex of sound and violence. He looked down at her. Her eyes were wide with shock, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Are you hurt?" he yelled over the din. She shook her head, her hand coming up to touch his face. "You came," she breathed, her voice filled with a stunned wonder. "I told you," he said, his own voice hoarse with adrenaline and emotion, "that I was done letting you take the arrows for me." He helped her to her feet, and they stood back to back, swords in hand, a king and his counselor, an unbreakable center in the heart of the storm. Together, they held the line until the rest of his forces arrived and the Unchained were finally, decisively broken. The dawn that followed the battle was clear and cold. The blizzard had passed, leaving the world blanketed in a pristine, silent white, a stark contrast to the grim aftermath of the fighting. The valley pass was secured, the threat of the Unchained contained. The kingdom was safe. Lucien found Vivien standing on a small rise overlooking the valley, her dark cloak stark against the snow. Her arm was in a sling, a clean break from the fall, but she stood tall, watching the sun glint off the distant peaks. He came to stand beside her, the silence between them comfortable, profound. "It is done," he said quietly. "Yes," she replied, her gaze not leaving the horizon. "The cost was high. But fewer lives were lost than in any campaign against them in the last 500 years, he countered. Because of your strategy. Because of you." She finally turned to look at him. There were smudges of dirt and dried blood on her cheek, and she looked more weary than he had ever seen her, but her eyes were luminous. "And because of your courage," she said. "That was a fool's charge," Lucian. The charge of a king who values one life above his own. I have discovered, he said, his voice dropping, that some lives are the anchor for one's own. Without them, you are simply adrift. He had spent a century adrift, a ship with a magnificent sail and no rudder, blown about by the winds of his own ego. She had been his rudder, his anchor, his harbor, and he had never known it. When I saw you, he confessed, the memory of the battle still raw, standing on that barricade. I understood something. I turned you into what you are so that I would not lose your counsel. It was the most selfish act of my life. But seeing you there, fighting for your own life, for the lives of those with you, I realized you were never just my counselor. You were always a queen in your own right. I was simply too blind to see the crown you wore. Tears welled in Vivian's eyes, bright and shimmering in the cold morning light. She had never wept, not once in the long, lonely years of her second life. But his words had breached a wall deep inside her, a place of ancient grief and buried hope. Lucian, she began, her voice failing her. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her uninjured cheek, his thumb brushing away a single, perfect tear. I am not asking you to be my shield, Vivian. I am not asking you to be my shadow, or my counselor, or even my queen. He stepped closer, the space between them vanishing, until they were breathing the same cold, clean air. He looked into her eyes, and in them, he saw not just their shared past, but the promise of a future he had never dared to imagine. I am asking you to stand with me, he said, his voice thick with the weight of his final, most important confession. To rule with me. To build this kingdom, together. As equals. As partners. As whatever we will become. It was not a proposal born of political necessity or lonely desperation. It was a plea for a shared existence, an admission that he was incomplete without her. He was not offering her a position, he was offering her himself. All of him. The flawed, arrogant king he had been, and the humbled, hopeful man he was becoming. Vivian leaned into his touch, a gesture of surrender and acceptance that was more eloquent than any words. She had stepped back from him to find herself, and in doing so, had allowed him to find himself, too. Their journey had not been one of forgiveness, but of transformation. They had both been broken, and in the space between the pieces, they had found the room to grow into something new. She lifted her good hand and placed it over his, pressing his palm more firmly against her skin. Yes, she whispered. It was a simple word, but it held the weight of a new world. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of homecoming. It was a quiet, reverent acknowledgement of a bond that had been shattered and reforged in fire, stronger and more brilliant than before. They stood there for a long time, two immortal beings on a snow-covered hill, the rising sun casting their two shadows as one on the ground behind them, a single, unified shape stretching out toward the horizon of their new kingdom. The silence was no longer empty, and the future was no longer a path one walked in front of the other, but a road they would travel, finally, side by side.